Huamenda. Good morning. It is a great pleasure to be in conversation with you today. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you to the organizers and to all the staff who have made this symposium possible. It is certainly an honor to have been invited by Director Sara Peilander and Research Director Marja Tiilikainen to speak with you today. Please accept my sincere congratulations on the Institute's 50th anniversary. I acknowledge the place where I wrote this talk and where I live, the traditional and contemporary lands of the Dakota and Anishinaabe people, a place now known as the state of Minnesota in the USA. The word Minnesota derives from the phrase Minnesota Makoche, which means the land where the water reflects the sky, a phrase now included in our official state seal. We are a land of many lakes, as is Finland. I am honored to visit the country of Finland, and I acknowledge the geographic boundaries include the land of the Sami, about whom I continue to educate myself. I can recommend the freely accessible online resource called nativelands.ca for learning about Indigenous lands when traveling. Minnesota is often understood as a great state to live in, yet by many measures, it is the worst state to live in for Black people, a complexity that Professor Myers at the University of Minnesota names the Minnesota Paradox. Minnesota is the place where George Floyd was murdered in 2020, a tragedy that ignited a globally wide racial reckoning. This reckoning accelerated long-standing work towards equity, diversity, and inclusion in the archival profession, at my institution, and in my life and work, all of which affect what I share with you here today. For example, the University of Minnesota Libraries, where I work, now state publicly that inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility are the guiding principles for every aspect of work in the university libraries. As individuals and as a whole, we commit to actions that reject racism and advance social justice. We must be anti-racist, foster diversity and equity, and ensure inclusion and belonging. In my scholarship, I seek to engage with critical archival theory and practice, which uses an ethical or political lens and demands attention to structural aspects, including questions of privilege and power. In sharing with you today about our work in Minnesota, preserving and sharing historical records to advance understanding of migration to North America, I do so with the spirit of offering potentially useful example or productive provocations and questions for us as we collectively consider the future of the archives of migration. I'll encourage a socially engaged and culturally competent approach to archives of migration. As are many terms likely discussed in this symposium, so too are the words community and archives contested or nuanced by personal choices and by broader context, such as the historical or the national. The word archives now enjoys a strong interest by the public and by the research professions, all of which widen its potential meanings. I will use the word archives as it is defined by the Society of American Archivists, who, while officially recognizing no less than 12 uses of the word, centers these three. First, denoting the records created by human beings as they conduct their lives. These are often unique and unpublished, and the material exists within a grouping, often a natural accumulation. Second, the location where such records are made accessible and preserved. Or third, the organization responsible for both of these. I'll use the term archiving today to mean action resulting in the care for such archives. And for the purposes of this talk, I simplify community to mean a group sharing a self-defined common interest or experience, such as identity or research interests. The University of Minnesota's Anderson Library is a large research library enjoying a location on the banks of the Mississippi River in the city of Minneapolis. The Immigration History Research Center archives within it specializes in archival material that informs primarily on migration experiences, though it supports many areas of inquiry. It is one of 16 distinct colleague archives, and each specializes in a different topic, such as LGBTQ studies, African American literature, or computing history. All of us strive to share cultural heritage source materials, and today we accomplish this by diversifying the historical record, lowering barriers to the access to information, and providing welcoming spaces and useful services. Here are the archive storeroom with some of our community collaborators from the Minneapolis-based Somali American Art Gallery and Archives, and also our reading room, which is usually full of quite a few people. The chairs are usually full, and to which we warmly welcome you. The Immigration History Research Center Archives, and I will use the acronym today, IHRCA, is an archives to support inquiry and understanding of migration, ethnicity, race, and more. Our archives has its roots in Minnesota, seeks to engage with Minnesota, and yet is not limited to Minnesota people or history. Rather, we have a North American-wide collection scope. In practice, the collection is global in its coverage, providing us a global community of users, and brings us local to international archival projects. By nature of our location and many local relationships, we are at times Minnesota-centered. Migration to Minnesota ranges from indigenous travelers to Anglo settlers to African Americans, Africans, Asians, Europeans, and more. More recent immigrant groups include Ethiopian, Hmong, Indian, Somali, and Karen, as well as many folks with multi-dimensional identities. Community engagement dates from our foundation, when university scholars began to work with community-based creators and collectors of historical records, including Finns in northern Minnesota, to build a collection of archival material of immigrant groups who were not then well documented in the large established archival and library institutions. Our founders' intent was to fill the obvious lacunae in the broad historical and archival record. Our predecessors and these collections soon grew into an academic unit for decades thereafter known as the Immigration History Research Center. During this era, archival management and records preservation worked side by side with an academic research program, scholarly production, and public engagement. Then in 2012, the management of the archival and the library collections were moved out of the center and returned to the libraries at the university, with the staff and collection to be known thereafter as the Immigration History Research Center Archives. The Archives today continues to work closely with the Immigration History Research Center that continues as an interdisciplinary center within the university's Department of History, but physically also in Anderson Library. Many of you have had the opportunity to meet my colleague from the center who is here with us today, Dr. Michelle Waslin. The Archives and the Center also enjoy a long and fruitful relationship with the Migration Institute of Finland. In addition, in addition to sharing many aspects of mission, we've worked together on transnational projects, all providing a grounding for us this year as we work on our current project, Migrant Experiences Past and Present, a new Finland-U.S. research and archival partnership, funded by the U.S. Embassy in Finland's Public Diplomacy Grant. In this, we are hosting public conversations regarding migration and also conducting archival work, including the close reading of documents and photographs in the Carl Lehtinen personal papers. In the process of this close read, we are describing them in 3 languages and digitizing, and these copies will be shared in open access portals such as the Digital Public Library of America. Through this work, we are illuminating material on other folks, including females in the family and the journalist Lempi Ikavaliko, and on Finns and Finnish Americans of Newport, New Hampshire. Welcome resources for the Institute and researchers of Finnish American history. And here is Carl in his moon in the early 20th century, and Finn Hall in Newport. Our predecessors were equally interested in sharing historical sources. On this slide are shown 2 examples of our institution's collaborations and collegiality. In 1976, Dr. Michael Carney of Minnesota visited you for a symposium discussing in part the exchange of historical sources. Also that year, former President Kekkonen visited the University of Minnesota, and while there viewed our photographs of Finnish settlers and immigrants, such as these shown here. Today, the Archives and our Colleagues Center work together on public programming and education, often hosting conversations, sharing our space, and building relationship with community, in part to support or co-create archives. Through this outreach, we seek to develop reciprocally meaningful relationships with community collaborators. As curator of the IHRCA, such community-engaged work is as important to us today as is our other core functions of providing access to historical materials or acquiring more material. The Archives also creates or co-creates with community organizations exhibits open to the public. These slides provide a glimpse of 2 past exhibits, first on the 150th anniversary of Finnish settlers in Minnesota, which continues to often visit the ethnic festival in the US called FinFest. And second, our own 50th anniversary exhibit entitled People on the Move, which invited visitors to participate in creating a migration map, sharing their own real or imagined path of travel. We were born within the social history movement in the 1960s as a small program to collect archives of recent immigrants to America from Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe. We later expanded the scope to folks arriving in Canada and to immigrants from the Eastern Mediterranean, Southeast Asia, and late 20th and early 21st century immigrants and refugees from around the globe. And by 1990, the curators were explaining that their work was influenced by growing interest in the communities formed by ethnically identifying people, and in women, children, and family units. Today, we are influenced by a demand for sources on the lived experiences of migrating peoples understood broadly and inclusively, and we increasingly center those who are recent migrants, people of color, and those of the global majority, because these are underrepresented in our existing collections. Also deeply affecting us is the strong interest from within migrating communities to archive their experiences, either with us or independently. The institutional strategic goals I noted earlier, to diversify the available historical record and amplify various voices that can be heard in archival material, support both these wider interests. As curator today, I balance these while I also ask myself challenging questions regarding institutional wealth and power, such as, in a community collaboration, are we transparent about the power dynamics at play and our goals? And am I willing to allow others to lead? Is the collaboration born within the predominantly white institution, or is it born in broader community? Are we creating an archives that is a site of cultural exchange, transforming ourselves as it might transform others? Are we continuing to serve the same communities repeatedly, or are we working towards newer relationships? Who benefits from any archival acquisition? Is the archival work extractive, or is it generative? Will our work build trust for my institution among the wider community? These questions are made possible in part by a general turn in the field of archives away from foundational or older principles and methods to that which allows for the alternative and embraces the social and the cultural. This arc is described by archival scholar Jeanette Bastian as our evolving global sensitivities to issues of social justice and archival silences. I also connect my questions to my journey in cultural competency and cultural humility. As I've shared in my article about cultural competency and its usefulness to archivists, my own archival knowledge as well as my cultural competency grew when working with Abde Roble, a Somali photographer and community archivist living in Minneapolis. You saw a picture of him earlier. He proposed a year-long archival residency for himself at the IHRCA, and we readily agreed. This year provided me the opportunity to learn from Roble the importance of the perspective of the people who can be located within archival records, whether they be the creators and the authors or the subjects of discussion within. My awareness was also raised for the first time of how in our American setting, the phrase heavily used in archival and research circles, to document, can be mistrusted and problematic to many. And through Mr. Roble, the IHRCA has developed other relationships among Somali American archivists. These experiences bring me, who is not of migrating community, opportunity to learn from wisdom and experiences of migrant community archivists. The asset-based approach, honoring the strengths and the knowledge of community partners, is inherent in the cultural competency framework. For the library and archives arena, cultural competency is defined in part as the capacity to recognize the significance of culture in one's own life and in the lives of others, to acquire and respectfully use knowledge of diverse ethnic and cultural groups, to strengthen programs and services through increased community participation, and to implement policies that benefit diverse populations and communities. Community clearly plays another role in the IHRCA in that much material available are a result of historical community members who recognize that archival records can be crucial acts of personal and cultural agency. As discussed by previous curator Joel Worrell, the creation and preservation of archives can be a major goal of migrating peoples. One example of archiving expressly for the purpose of community building and supporting resettlement was by the United Ukrainian American Relief Committee, who aided approximately 50,000 Ukrainians settling in the U.S. between 1947 and 1957. They were one of many ethnic identity organizations who intentionally kept records to meet their urgent need for the continuation of their culture and identity, then in threat due to Soviet domination. In their new homelands, displaced communities such as this one cared for their historical records, in many cases establishing archival institutions of their own. Later, much of that material came to the IHRCA, and these continue to hold an important role for community members. We recognize that the records we have in Minnesota are of great value to people in the source country and beyond. Source country and beyond. Due to the high interest from Estonia to recover or discover diaspora sources, for example, we've developed with the National Archives of Estonia an intercultural collaborative model of archival work involving multilingual description and work exchanges. A final example of some community-led archival work at the IHRCA that I will share today is with the hiring of expertise located in community. Refugee-related archives continue to be an area of growth for us, and we recently received the career papers of Anne Dykstra, a white Western refugee camp educator who worked in Cambodia and the Philippines. With this collection, we are balancing goals of making these publicly available for research as soon as possible due to the high interest in them, with taking care regarding the people existing within these files. Our approach fits into the methodology often called slow archives, which allows for taking time to be responsive and make changes in the process of doing your work, and to prioritize community collaborators. As the IHRCA does not have a refugee community member on our staff, we found among our wider community of friends and colleagues a knowledgeable consultant who then guided us in cultural sensitivity towards the record's content and the people represented therein. The consultant shared with us where there is material created by members of the refugee communities themselves, or about culturally and personally sensitive material. We also have the goal to be alert to information within the records that would support any human rights claims in the future, guided by an International Council on Archives document on human rights. For the first time in my career, I prioritized consideration of human rights claims while archiving. This is an example of evolving archival practice based on next best practices, global awareness, teachings from community members, and concerns for the rights of people located within the archives. Methods are changing in our cognate fields too, and these provide us valuable models. As our colleague here with us today, I think, Anna Rastas, is she here? Hey. And her collaborator found when working in a museum on the topic of diaspora with Somali and Afro-Finns, Somalis who held agency over the museum's depiction of Somali experience created narrative on their political activities as Finns and as members of diaspora, as well as on their family life and cultural organizations, rather than presenting themselves primarily as migrants or refugees. What does this teach us regarding migrant agency within migration archives? What experiences of people will we center? Will archives like this museum be locations of intercultural heritage work directed by migrants who co-create our next historical narratives? I hope so. The Migration Archives Working Group meeting today will consider the questions. Do Finnish archives represent the diversity of cultures and experiences in Finland today? Can the creation of a Finnish immigration archive change the ways Finnish history and culture are understood, represented, and researched? It is an interesting exercise for me to replace Finnish here with North American and ask the same questions of our work in Minnesota. Answers to myself are not yet, not enough, and yes, it can. In our Archives of Migration, I will seek to be community-led, supporting diverse historical sources to be used in research into the future. Thank you for this opportunity to reflect and share, and I wish you all well in our collective work towards an inclusive future. Kiitos.